and foremost, I want to say some thank yous to our sponsors for making our Naturalist Journeys presentation series possible. So I want to say a big thanks to Hunger Mountain Co-op and 802 Coffee as being our lead sponsors, as well as all the other great folks that you can see on the screen right now. And I see somebody mentioning in the chat that there's no sound, but I'm assuming that for other folks that sound is a-okay. Yep, Richard says that the sound works. So folks, please feel free to use the chat to communicate with me throughout the event. I believe it's set right now so that you can all, everybody can see everybody's messages. Also use the Q&A if you have any questions to ask. We'll have some time for Q&A at the very end, but as you think of questions, feel free to pop them into the Q&A and we'll moderate those as we get towards the end of the talk tonight. This is our 27th year of Naturalist Journeys programs at North Branch Nature Center, and it's awesome having the opportunity to bring these into the virtual space because it allows us to welcome folks, not only audience members, but presenters from all over the country and all over the world, not just folks that are within a convenient drive to Montpelier. So thanks to all of you for coming into virtual space with us. Anyway, we're really excited to have Jill here tonight. Jill is an amazing artist and great scientist, and seeing her work combine those two zones together so beautifully is quite a thing to see. And so I'm really excited to learn from you, Jill, tonight. I know that folks who are tuning in likely read Jill's bio and more about her work prior to joining us. So I'll let you read more about Jill on your own, and I'll let Jill introduce herself more as we go. But Jill, thank you so much for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Sean, and thanks everyone so much for coming tonight. I am going to be talking to you all tonight about what I do with my artwork, which is primarily science communication. And so I'll talk a little bit about why I do that. I'll show you some different examples of my art over time. And I'll talk a little bit about my process and behind the scenes, and also a little bit about what other things I try to do with it to get more people to see it. One of the early examples of when I first started making art that incorporates data and graphs in it is here in the background. And so this is a piece of one of my paintings that was about salmon, and underneath the salmon is that jagged line, and that is a graph that's real data. And what that data is the population of these salmon over time. And so, going up and down over the years with an overall trend to there being less salmon. And this was a particular group in Washington State where I'm now living. And so this is the kind of thing I do with my art, is I try to weave in these graph lines to help me tell the story. So I have that information piece in there to show people something that's happening in the world, and I try to help connect it with the visuals that I have. So I work full-time as an artist and a science communicator. And so photo on the left is me working in a studio space. I actually only just moved to Washington State this past May. And before that, I was living in Maine for about 10 years. So that was the studio I had in Portland, Maine, where I worked. And then the photo on the right is research that I do here in Washington State in the mountain glaciers. Research that I've been doing for, as of this year, 15 years. And so a lot of that kind of science background that I have has really informed my artwork that I do now. So here's one more photo of working in Washington State. This is work I do every August. And so that's why I'm wearing shorts, because, even though it's up in the mountains on the glaciers, it's still like summer there, and it's, not as warm as down in town, but it's still pretty warm up on the mountains. And what I do in these types of places is basically just study how they're changing right now with warming. So how all that snow and ice behind me is, basically melting due to climate change, and how much that happens every year. I went to the University of Maine for both undergrad and a master's of science. And during that time, or during my master's research, I worked down in Antarctica because there's a big team at UMaine who does that. So that was really fortunate opportunity. And again, like getting to see someplace and now people get to see and study it and how it's changing was really important for me, and like this kind of fuel that I have again, and this knowledge, this connection with the science world that I have that I can really use in the artwork that I make today. And I should also say that I also got a degree in studio art. So it was kind of always something I was building, was this kind of plan in trying to combine art and science in some way for my career. I wanted to show you guys just one example of the art that I made when I was in high school, because I'll talk about later, but I work with a lot of students today, and it helps to look back at my own early work to think about how much, we understand and how much we process and think about when we're, in middle and high school, for example, about important topics in the world. So this was a series of paintings I made, I think when I was a junior or senior in high school. And these 3 paintings were basically a story. And so starting on the left, that girl sitting down was supposed to be me at the time in front of this big snowy mountain, one of the mountains I work on in Washington. And I love those. I love winter. I love snow. I love those types of environments. And so I represented that kind of love by these like kind of magical looking plants that were growing, kind of representing the emotions I felt around that place. And so then the painting panel in the middle is supposed to be me having come back as an adult and going back to that same mountain, but now it's really changed and a lot of the snow and ice has retreated and thinned. So there's less of those kind of magical plants, less of that, feeling there. And so as you guys might guess, the panel on the right is coming back as an older woman, and most of the snow and ice is completely gone from the mountain. And so I wanted to show this just because, again, where a lot of like youth are at around these topics is kind of all these emotions and concern. But I know for me at that age, the only education around these topics I got was from my parents, not at all in school. Unfortunately, that's changing in a lot of ways, but there's so much I had to express and was trying to express in my art. Even at that time, it was just always something I was kind of concerned about and passionate about putting into my artwork. And then as I went to college, that kind of took the form of these types of paintings, which are like kind of more landscapes and things from getting to do science research in different places. These were all paintings from scenes working in Washington State and working in Canada in the mountains. And so that was what I would do. I would either bring art supplies with me out to these places while doing field work, or I would make these paintings based on photographs that I took when I was back home again. And so I was always trying to kind of push like how to tell a story and share science through my artwork. But I knew I wanted to push it beyond just showing it in a landscape, even though that's really powerful. I just wanted to do something different than that. So I'm going to show you a few different examples of some of my data art from over the years. These are 2 different paintings that I just put side by side. So I'll talk about the one on the left first. And the painting on the left is showing all these different plants. And then the orange kind of going right through the middle of the painting is the data that I put in there. And the data is basically the 4 different graphs of temperature rise for the world through the year 2100. So basically, these are 4 different possibilities from low to high of continued temperature rise. And, basically the low one would be us taking kind of more action around climate change and fossil fuels now versus the higher amount showing less action. And so above the graph, all of those plants are supposed to be basically species that are really common in Maine and in like more northern New England, a lot of different trees and flowers and things that are there now. And then below the orange is supposed to be some plant species that are maybe more common further south that maybe would start to grow, higher or farther north as the climate warmed and it allowed that environment for them. So that painting was titled Overgrown. And like most of my work, it is primarily watercolor, and then it has some details of colored pencil, some details of acrylic paint. The painting on the right was one I completed, I believe, in 2020. And this one was about coastal change in Maine. And so I painted the scene of kind of like a bit of a, grassy marsh along the coast and then like a beach. And so I was trying to basically communicate about sea level rise affecting coastal areas, affecting ecosystems like a marsh, affecting coastal infrastructure. And so the data that's like that blue line cutting across and up is showing sea level rise from 1880 to present, and present is where that blue line separates into three, and those three dashed lines show the three most likely scenarios for future rise, which again is something I've done a lot in my work, is showing like, okay, this is what's happened, but we got to think about what's going to happen, and we are, because that I think highlights how important our current action is today. And then in the background, the green lines are a bar graph. And so what that bar graph is showing is the amount of renewable energy use in Maine from the 1960s to present day. And so just kind of showing that one kind of type of positive change that is being made in the state. And you can find these graphs for any state in the US on I think it's the Energy Information Administration, or it's either way, the acronym is EIA, and it's fun to look at what different states are doing around that. And then I wanted to share the painting. I made a painting for, I'll play this little animation, the cover of Time magazine, and this was in July of 2020. And so that was really obviously a huge opportunity for me as like a young artist to have my work displayed in that kind of platform. And so I'm really proud of that. And I think the opportunity largely came about because I have this kind of niche or specific area in art. And so the creative director at Time had seen my work online and had reached out to me, which also told me, as an artist, as a creative, you can always try for an opportunity, because the worst that could happen is, you don't hear back or you don't get it. And so this painting was basically about global climate change. And so I had 5 different graphs in this painting. And so I'll just quickly go through what those are. The bottom area with the dark blue is showing sea level rise. The light blue is supposed to be ice, and that's showing the decrease in land ice over time. And so by land ice, I just mean the 2 ice sheets, Antarctica and Greenland, and then all of the ice kind of combined on mountain glaciers around the world. The green trees are showing the increasing use of renewable energy globally. The yellow area is showing the increase in average global temperature. And then the gray area showing the use or consumption of fossil fuels over time. And so I know those graphs can be really dramatic, and that's why I think it's kind of important to pair them together and to see how all of these effects kind of feed on each other. And at the top of the fossil fuel graph, I just wanted to mention there's like a slight decline. And that's because at the beginning of 2020, when a lot of things really shut down, there was like this little blip in like use of, cars and plane travel, and I'm sure lots of other things that were happening at such a big scale globally that it caused this decrease in use of fossil fuels that year. And so it's a really good example of how if we act on that kind of big scale, it can really quickly make a difference in what we're putting out in the world. And then as a last full example of my art, I wanted to share one of my most recent paintings. I haven't put this like online very much yet or on my website yet or anything, because I just finished it right before, or basically in like mid to late December. And I had to wait to get like this like good image done of the painting. And so this was a painting that is basically about seabirds off the coast in Maine on a lot of the little rocky islands that dot the coast. So these little rocky islands are really important habitats for like tons of different species of seabirds. And this painting was specifically about puffins and then about 2 different species of terns, which are the birds that look a little bit more like gulls and things on the right. And so I had 3 different graphs in this painting that are basically just about the population of these birds. And so this first one, I highlighted, if you can see that in the light blue, I know it kind of blends in, was about the population of Atlantic puffins on Seal Island in Maine, which is, if you're familiar, kind of off the coast of like the Rockland, Rockport, Camden area. And then the second graph in yellow was about the population of common terns on the same island, Seal Island. And these graphs are from, I believe, 1999 to present. And then the third graph in green that I just showed is about the population of Arctic terns on Seal Island. And so the story here is kind of like there's been all these restoration efforts going into protecting these seabirds for a long time. With common terns overall, the yellow graph, it's actually been making a pretty big difference. It's not as clear on this island, but it is on other islands, whereas Arctic terns have just been in decline despite those efforts. And puffins have kind of been up and down, but they've overall been having a hard time in recent years. And so basically this was a story of change, of them being affected by warming water temperatures, which affects what is available for them to eat and things like that. And so this was my most recent work that's going to be on display at the visitor center for the Maine Coastal Islands National Wildlife Refuge in Rockland, Maine. And so they'll have this on permanent display there. So I want to talk about why I'm combining data and art together and why I think that can be a good way to communicate with certain people. So I know that data for a lot of people, like any age, can be kind of abstract and can be kind of difficult to read. It's, and some data is just really complex, but I think it's important for us to have some basic skills around kind of looking at a graph about like, climate change, about COVID, whatever it is that, we should be able to interpret and think about, like, what does this really mean to me in the real world? And so this is a graph, as it says, about average global temperature from 1880 to present day. And this is obviously like a big picture, important story about what's happening in the world. But I think sometimes when we look at this data by itself, even if we kind of take the time to look at it, figure out what it's saying, we don't necessarily connect it to that, real world, I guess, like emotion, or like think about what that means for our lives, for people's lives that we know, and why these topics really matter. And so one thing I think about around temperature change is forest fires. And that's because of where I've worked for a long time and now live in Washington. These were 2 photos I took a few summers back working in the mountains in Washington State in August. Pretty much since 2015, every time I go work out in Washington in the summer, there's a lot of issue with forest fire smoke. And so this was like one day to the next, working with this like beautiful mountain lake behind where we were, and we were camping up there. And so that's something that has become like just really, really unpleasant because you don't always know when the winds are going to shift, how long you're going to be like kind of in the smoke. It doesn't always feel good to breathe, and it like, smells bad. It's not amazing for your health. And so it's just something that I think about around temperature change, especially because now that I don't just work in Washington part of the year, I live here. It's something that affects me in the town that I live in as well. And so I put this kind of smoky image behind that graph because that's the kind of connection I first thought of, and it would be different for every person. But this is something I think of around temperature, is it's not one-to-one, but there's this relationship between, increased temperature and these dry conditions that are causing all these fires, as well as other reasons. So side by side, this is the graph and then the painting I made about this topic. And this was a really early data art painting from when I first started doing this in 2015. And so I just wanted to show this side by side because the data is really important on its own. And the goal of my art isn't to be better, to replace it. It's to make sure more people learn about and see that data and do it in different ways and try to get more of that emotional story out of it. Oh, I'm sorry. So this is the painting then on its own, and that graph that's like the top surface or the top of the trees is the increase in global temperature with all these kind of dramatic colors I was trying to show around fires. So for me, in combining data and art, I'm just trying to build these new connections and seeing data and seeing the world around us as it's represented by graphs. And so my goal with the form of science communication I'm doing with my art is helping others to learn about our environment, but trying to make it in ways that are maybe more accessible or relatable. There's a lot of, everyone has different interests. They have different, strengths in learning. Everyone has different access to, what they see and read out there. And so having more forms of communication around these topics is really important. So I'm going to just show kind of behind the scenes of my process. I kind of just like to show like how I make my work and what that looks like. And so the first thing that I do is, of course, just choosing the topic. Sometimes it's sometimes I find data first. Sometimes I find a topic first and then I research it for data. But sometimes it's something that I just personally have decided to make work about. But also I often will do certain commissions, like for science research groups or for nonprofit environmental groups. And so sometimes they're bringing data to me. And so once I have that kind of topic in mind, I'll research it. And then I can kind of brainstorm and sketch what it's going to look like and then create it. So I'm going to walk you through a painting I finished just about a year ago. And so the topic idea I had was about sea level rise and its effect on grassy marsh areas. And so these were some photos I had just found online. They're not my photos. And they were just to get me thinking like, okay, what am I going to show with this painting? Let me start just, kind of visualizing it, thinking about it. I did go and take some of my own photos and marshes in Maine as well. When I was planning this. I'll start to research information about that topic and just to learn, like a basic background about what's happening so that I can, just tell an accurate story about it with my art. And so I'll find graphs during that stage. And so I had 3 graphs in this painting. So this is the first one, which is about sea level rise. So this is sea level rise from 1990 to present day. And so I used this as one of the graphs in my painting. I also was trying to use graphs that were showing kind of like positive actions people are taking. And while there's a lot of positive action, it's hard to find data about that. And so I used this graph that is in the green that says protecting the environment. And so what it was showing was from the Pew Research Center, basically a rough percentage of US adults who say that protecting the environment should be a top priority. And so that number has increased from about 40% to about 65% over just a little over a decade, which is a really, positive thing to have that shift. And then I also used this graph, which is basically about national wildlife refuge land. And I did it for Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. And it was just those 3 states because those are the 3 that border the Gulf of Maine, where I was making this painting about. And so you can see a lot more land is being set aside for national wildlife refuges over time. My next step is to do a lot of sketching and brainstorming. And this for me is the most difficult part of the process because it's coming up with that new idea and deciding what the art is going to look like. I think there's a lot of different ways to have an art process, but I think for artists like me who really plan out work, sometimes an idea just comes to you, but that's not usually going to be the case. And that first idea that comes to you, you can probably push it and make it stronger. And so I'm trying to think about my story as I sketch and what I'm going to really show and communicate. And so I make these really simple sketches. These are my real sketches for this project. They're just really tiny thumbnails, a couple inches, with, scribbles and stick figures, basically, that are my way of planning. And the more of these I do, I start getting some stronger ideas and some new ideas. It's kind of like when you're working on like writing and your first draft is rough, and then as you like go back, it can make it kind of making it stronger and thinking of things that you hadn't the first time around. So I'll take one of those. I'll make however many I need, 20, it could be more, little sketches, and then I'll choose a few that are favorites, and I'll make this a slightly a more detailed sketch that is kind of a closer version of what my final painting might look like. And so this one, there's supposed to be the sea level rise data at the bottom, kind of that darker area going up with the fish. And behind that is supposed to be the marsh. So the people are supposed to be in shallow water with grass, and then the background trees. So this is the sketch that I was kind of at the point of being kind of close to that final idea. And then the other step I do during that phase is I'll collect a bunch of images and put them together in a folder, or like one presentation on my computer. And again, I'll take some of my own photos, but there's a lot of things I can't necessarily take good photos of, like these different species. And so I'll collect them all so that I'm using them as references, and having so many, I'm not, copying a photo for my art. And then for my process, I sketch everything out first with pencil just to decide where everything goes, and then I can erase things. So this is part of that process. And then these are the paintings when I started them. So I'd sketched everything out and I just started applying some paint. And the paintings were big. They were almost each 2 by 3 feet. And the image that I painted is continuous from like one panel to the next. So you'll see as it goes, it's like one continuous image just split onto 2 pieces of paper. And the green is a painter's tape, just to tape them to kind of a foam board I had to keep them flat and to keep the borders of the paper clean. So I'll just kind of quickly go through these progress photos, working on different areas, painted just around the fish to start with the kind of green color I chose for the ocean. And then I was filling in yellow for the grass because I kind of had it be more of in the fall. This is my studio space when I was working on it, which was in Portland, Maine. And then filling in a lot more of detail for the grass and the trees. You can see I'm getting pretty close to being done. I have the people in this painting, and so they're still white. I haven't painted them yet. And then these are the paintings complete. And so it's kind of, again, hard to show on the screen because they're really large and in person, and there's a lot of detail to it. So I'll show a few close-ups, but my scene, again, was this coastal marsh with shallow water and the grass, and then like the more open ocean at the bottom with that sea level rise graph. And so the sea level rise graph is cutting across or cutting up and across the painting at the bottom there. And so then I have that graph and I have those 2 dashed lines again, as you've seen in some of my work, showing potential future rise. So I'm going to show you just a few quick details. These are the 2 dashed lines of projected rise that I showed. And then these are the 2 other graphs that I talked about. And so the graph that's in light green is that percentage of US voters who want to protect the environment. And then the graph in yellow is the increasing national wildlife land. And so I was trying to have those more positive examples of action. And it's hard because in comparison to the sea level rise graph, they look small, but it's just because we have a lot of data for something like sea level rise, and these data sets are going to be shorter. So they're no less powerful of data sets despite the size and length of time. And then a few close-ups of the people. Like I had people just walking around and observing in the landscape. There's a person that's measuring water depth with a ruler in the marsh. And then there are two women that are planting grass, because a lot of marsh restoration in these areas where basically sea level rise can encroach on these environments, or it's been like the grass has been removed for like farming or other things like that. And then I just thought I'd share a lot of my poses for people. I will find some reference images online that I kind of loosely use, but I'll also just have local friends pose to help me kind of figure out like positions for people for my work. And then a few close-ups of some of the fish. I researched different species that live kind of shallower, or at least come in shallower in the Gulf of Maine. And then some species of birds in the marshes there as well. And then these paintings are my first ones I've ever had as part of a museum show, which is really exciting for me. And so these are at currently still the PVD Essex Museum, which is in Salem, Massachusetts, just a little bit north of Boston. And so they're part of a big group show that you can see on the right is called Climate Action Inspiring Change. So all of the artwork in this big group show of like 25 to 30 artists is about more of a positive or hopeful messages around climate change, which I think is really awesome. So these have been up since last April, and they will remain up till June of this year. And so again, these are the three graphs I used for this painting, and they're really important. Data is really important, but I'm just trying to share these stories in different ways and kind of weave them together in different ways with my artwork. And I just think it's such a different effect in how it communicates to people. So just a couple more things to share. I wanted to just quickly show how I connect some of this artwork with other people beyond sharing my work. And so one thing I do is I have designed this data art idea as kind of a curriculum or project for students, a little bit in elementary school, but especially middle and high school. And so the students I found really understand the data and they understand how they understand climate change, they understand the environment to some extent. They're concerned about it, they feel a lot of emotions around it. And so it's really inspiring, but can be hard to go work with these classes. I really want to make sure they also see these messages of hope and action around climate change too. So these photos are from working with a middle school, 6th through 8th in Colorado that I worked with this April. I don't usually get to go, really be hands-on with schools in person, but I was able to because the school had funding to work with the whole middle school. And so these kids are working on their own data art. And then here's a few examples of some student data art from over the years. And I'm always really blown away by it, even in like the younger grades. Like I'm meeting with a 5th grade group soon, and they get it and they can do it. And so it's just really inspiring for me to see what they care about, what they're concerned about. And it's really hopeful for me to see how much of this generation is getting taught about it, and thus, what they understand and care about. And some more examples as well. And the photo on the right is one of the middle school girls who I worked with in Colorado, and she's showing, we had like a public display in like a local coffee shop of the student artwork at the end. So she's showing her artwork in the coffee shop. So it's just really, it's become a big part of what I do to work with schools. I work with a bunch every school year. And just another way for me to share this kind of idea of learning, because it's interdisciplinary. It's a way for them to kind of connect and engage with these topics at a deeper level, because they really have to think about the data. They can't just graph it and be done with the project. They have to really interpret it in like in a more emotional way and think about how they would share it visually. So I think that, you know, science communication has grown so much as a field since I kind of began down this path. And so that's really inspiring to see. I think there's so many different forms of sharing science with people. And so, for example, like the top left where I have website is the website for the project I work with on the glaciers here in Washington every year. And so that's the project website, which has tons of information about it. We also have tons of different photographs about the projects that we share, also on like social media or with journalists and things like that. On the top right is an example of landscape art. When I work with the project, I make art, but I also sometimes bring other artists into the field with us, and they make art about that as well, about the science that we're doing, about the landscape, whatever they choose. In the bottom left is one of the science papers that the project has produced in a journal. And so there's that kind of more, that very important, but like only accessible to certain audience type of thing is like the science paper with lots of data and information. Then the data itself is again, like mainly in these papers or on like science websites. And so then my data art is like another component, or the student data art, another component. And I think we need all these different types of forms and others, you know, music, you know, writing, things like that about important topics. And so for me, that's about climate change or environmental topics. But there's all these different forms have their different strengths and weaknesses in terms of what audiences they can reach. So I think my primary takeaways in sharing this with you all tonight is I think art is a really powerful way to connect with people. And it always has been. Obviously not, you know, everyone, but a lot of people do connect with it really well. And so I think it has so much emotion in it. So it can really share people or be a lens to share with people things that we care about. And that being said, as I just mentioned, like different media can really communicate complexities in different ways. So I'm doing it through the arts, but there's like journalism, there's science data, there's outreach in schools, there's all these different methods we use. I think that with creativity, important data can tell a more personal and relatable story than it does. I know for a lot of scientists, when they go and work in the field and are collecting this data, you know, are learning about climate change, it is really emotional, but that's not going to come across in their science research paper. There's not always a place for it. And so I think that's where science communication and creativity come in. And lastly, my main goal with the art that I create is being a part of this conversation around climate change. I know it's something that I talk a lot about, which of course, but I think not just about my art, kind of just in everyday life and observations. I think we're all really experiencing more now in the last 5 years, how much change has been happening to our, you know, seasons, to our weather, all these different things that we see and hear about and experience. And with that being said, there is that side of it, but I'm really inspired by when I do tune into what, you know, a lot of local communities are doing, what states have for action plans. There's a lot of these positive actions being taken as a result too. So that's also an important conversation. Thank you everyone very much for listening. I know that was a lot of information, a lot of data. And then thanks for attending. I look forward to if any of you guys have questions and hearing them.
Thank you so much, Jill. Folks, please go ahead and throw any questions you have in the Q&A. I have a whole bunch, so I'll ask a bunch while waiting for others to chime in here. So I was just wondering, I know you have a master's in you know, climate science. I was just curious if you've had the opportunity to illustrate your own illustrate data that you have generated yourself.
Oh, I have not illustrated data from my master's. I think it's partly because of the topic. It was basically like reconstructing the Antarctic ice sheet and how it responded to past warming. I think it would be cool, but I think I didn't do it because it's not as like relatable a topic for a lot of people as like current climate change. But I think it would still be cool too someday. The one example that I have illustrated is the research that I'm just a part of in Washington State. But I'm a big part of collecting that data. So I have made paintings using that data.
Cool. Yeah, I was just, really admiring, I think a lot of times in science, this is more of a comment than a question, but, a lot of times in science communication, there's this move towards like, okay, instead of using data to persuade or convince, instead try to tell a story or make emotional connections with that sort of thing. And I think that as people moving that direction, trying to do science communication, they just walk away from data entirely. And like you have this genius approach of bringing data with you into that story and into the art, and it's great because it sticks as well. Like that the graph you're showing about how between 2008 and present day, the percentage of people feeling that environment should be a top priority went from 40% to 60%. Like the fact that I can even remember that 10 minutes later is a sign that like this technique is really working and helping convey this information in a really unique way that is is catchy and yeah, obviously works. So anyway, I love that.
Thank you.
Question here. Let's see. Two young artists over here want to know why you chose to paint the marshes on 2 panels instead of one wide one.
Oh, good question. I think like for a couple reasons. For some reason, I kind of like that's called like a diptych when you have 2 paintings that go side by side like that. And I kind of like diptychs, like having this kind of slight separation or space between them and having them both like framed separately. I also think I did that because they are really large paintings where they're each about 2 by 3 feet. So it makes it a lot more feasible for me with like just a piece of paper like in front of me that I'm painting. I can like set one aside, and then it also made it more feasible for like framing them and hanging them and stuff. I love big paintings, so you can definitely do all one, but yeah, I think I just kind of like separating out these 2 panels. It kind of added to the storytelling aspect a little bit for me, I think.
When I was thinking about that painting, you were describing how you went about making it. Something that I couldn't ignore was that you picked the most consequential, most difficult part of the whole painting, I assume, to do at the very end, like painting the people. I imagine, like technically, I'm not a painter, but I imagine that that's probably the most is that the most challenging part of the whole painting? And if so, is it a little nerve-wracking to wait until you've already been working in this for weeks to put in the last bit like that?
That's a good point. Yeah, I think these paintings just took me so long and were so detailed that sometimes I just felt like a little overwhelmed by like I was trying to finish them for this museum show. And so I think like I kept putting off doing the people. So it was really helpful to have like I had a ton of reference photos of friends and then some random photos like online of people. And I did practice a little beforehand, but it is kind of scary. And with watercolor, you can't edit it that much as much as as like acrylic paint, for example. But I do like I have a little bit of a style with people, but I don't paint them very much. So I kind of yeah, so it was a little scary. It's probably a better idea to do them sooner, and I kind of just left them until the end, like you said.
I wasn't sure if that was an intentional strategy or procrastination or a combination of the two. I was wondering if you got to spend any time out on Seal Island or with the puffins and terns as part of the research for your seabird project.
No, I wish. I think I would have been able to if I was still living in Maine, which is too bad. So if I'm not going to be able to like go, I'm going to like mail my painting to them next week. And so when I do that, like I'm not going to be the one to like hang it and have it like get to hand deliver it. And so sometime when I visit Maine, I'll have to go see it. And I believe like the offer was kind of open to maybe do that, but I know it's seasonal when you can go see them, and I know they're like based on when they're nesting and things like that. So I would love to sometimes. I never saw puffins when I was in Maine or went to see them on the islands.
I was really interested in the work that you do with students and wondering, this is kind of, we at the Nature Center do some work with various different age groups in schools and already thinking about applications for this sort of thing with our high school students, and wondering if you work with high school students doing this, and just kind of what that process looks like. It seems like, you know, it must be a rather involved process. You're working with them, you know, multiple days. I'm just curious if you could paint a little bit more of a picture of what that relationship looks like with each school.
Yeah, it's nice because I feel like you can really curate the assignment depending on like the age group and what they're learning about in school at that time. And so like I can make it data they're learning about, I can make it, you know, local data they can relate to. Like if they're younger, it can be like we just provide them a few examples. If they're older, maybe they can, you know, research something themselves. But in terms of like my involvement, it can really vary too. So like this week, for example, I was meeting with a middle school group in California, so obviously virtually, and I just presented my work, like a kind of a shorter version of this, and then I also had like a more of a how-to stage to my presentation. And so I just am there to kind of be a guest speaker, kickstart the project, and then the teachers are doing the hard work. But then yeah, sometimes I have done hands-on, like me coming or me doing multiple check-ins on Zoom, like either way, or in person with schools. And so yeah, I think like I have some materials I can share. There's some online resources for the project, but I do a lot of them, and I have like I love taking on more work with schools if that's of interest to collaborate.
I was wondering for the Time magazine, changing gears, I was wondering if for the Time magazine cover, if that was data they provided you as like a commission saying, we want you to, you know, to paint these 5 things, or if that was more of a collaborative thing, or exactly what direction that collaboration went in.
Yeah, it was a really exciting like challenge because they didn't that I found the data to use. The only data that like we had talked about like what I could show in terms of data a little bit. Like I talked back and forth with the creative director, and I had to send him a bunch of ideas, and then we kind of both decided on that final idea. But the only data that they sent me that they were interested in me using was like the fossil fuel consumption data and showing that like slight decrease. And so I basically, yeah, had to come up with the idea and make it. And the turnaround time from when like he reached out to me was 2 weeks, which normally I would just always say no to something because my paintings often take me months. But obviously it's worth it to just kind of drop everything for that kind of project, and they are paying the artist. And so yeah, so anyway, it was like a 2-week thing where I came up with the idea, kind of got approval and created it. And even then there's no like, it depends on how it turns out, and so and just what they want. And so there was no guarantee it would be on the cover, even though he was going to push for that.
A couple other questions from the Q&A and chat. So what it's from Richard, what networking advice would you give to aspiring artists in this space?
I'm very much still learning about that myself. It's hard. I think that a couple of thoughts are, when I was trying to get going and like had started creating art and like had made some platform for myself, like I made my website and I had like social media account for it. Then I remember I pitched like sharing my art in articles with a few different like online resources that did like science communication. Like I remember my first big one was called Climate Central, and I just kind of like cold emailed them about sharing my work, and they ended up doing it. But whereas other times, like, you know, I don't always hear back. And so that's one thing, is just like reaching out to places that could share your work, like in the media. I've also like pitched my work to show at galleries and things like that. And then I think like having these kind of different platforms online is obviously so big now. And so I think just making that, like I said, like the website, or if you have, a shop, like an Etsy shop, if you have like a Patreon where people help support your work financially, things like that, to and then thinking about like who your audience is. So like I reached out to science communication places, and I reach out to environmental nonprofits and science researchers. So that's my kind of niche, but thinking about who the audience is, that maybe you could contact some, and you could even find a specific mentor in that realm.
Great, thanks. Question from Chelsea. She says, I really enjoyed seeing all the stages of your process, from the thumbnails to the more detailed sketches to the final paintings. Can you talk a little more about how the data influences your compositional choices, and at what point in the process that comes in?
Oh, good question. I really try to think about like the shapes that the graph makes. And so when I'm planning out and doing those thumbnails, I will think about it at that phase as like, first off, where does the graph go in the painting? Like, at the bottom, at the top, like, does it go across the whole painting, or does it end part way? And I try to work that in with like, the landscape, the animal, the like whatever element I have in my painting, and like make that, not always, but usually like incorporate that shape as part of like the scene that I'm creating. So that's, part of that planning process is to like weave it in some way and kind of figure out where it best fits.
Have you thought about doing experimenting with displaying other types of data besides like XY axes?
A little bit. The only other example I've done is I've done one painting that was like map based, with kind of like data points on the map. But I think I've done like XY based the most, just because the story is, I think, at least to me, the most like kind of clear, showing like a change over time. And so I think that communicates really well. But I've had students who've experimented even more with like doing like pie graphs or different types of graphs. But I think right now I would like to do some more map-based work, but beyond that, yeah, I think I'll primarily stick with, at least right now, like the XY.
And I'm curious if you have any inspirations that you'd like to share, other artists that you follow, or where you get some of your artistic inspiration from.
Oh yeah, it's hard because there's so many, there's so many folks, but a few in the like kind of environmental art realm. Well, I think Instagram has been a really good platform for me in terms of like connecting with other environmental artists. And I could always send some in the message in the chat after, but a few there's like the probably the biggest, or at least the biggest I know in this realm. Her name is Zariah Foreman, and she does really massive pastels of like icebergs and things like that, and like Greenland and Antarctica. They're super like hyper realistic. They're like, I don't know, like 10 or 20 feet, like they're huge and massive, and they're supposed to like immerse people in these landscapes. So she's someone who's gained a lot of success in this realm. And then two other quick examples. One is Claire Giordano. On Instagram, she goes by Claire's Wanderings, and she does a lot of like backpacking kind of art, where she'll bring like even big pieces of paper or canvas with her out into the mountains, and she'll paint these landscapes, but really kind of capture interesting elements about them. And she'll like journal about like the changes and put them in her art. And then and she's a friend of mine as well. And then the last example, right now, her name is Rose McAdoo. I also know her personally, and she basically, it's really interesting, so you just have to look it up, but she makes art using cakes and different types of baking elements. And so it's like this idea of bringing people together to like talk about these topics around food, but the food is like this really cool sculpture. And so she uses them for science communication. It's the kind of thing you could just kind of have to see it, I think, to understand what I'm talking about. So I could put those in the chat quickly at the end, but there's lots of cool people out there, and it's a growing field.
Yeah, super. Thanks. Yeah, I think maybe I'll grab the names of those folks and link to their websites and their work on our website on our
Oh,
presentations
great.
page, so people can find it there.
Perfect.
So I think with that, I think we'll wrap things up. Jill, thank you so much for sharing your work and your story with us. I had a great time, and I'm sure everybody else here did too. I hope one day that we get to hang your work on the walls at our nature center in our gallery, or that we get to work with you with our middle school and high school students in the future. But yeah, this has been a great pleasure.
Yes, likewise. Thank you. Thanks everyone for attending as well, for the opportunity.
Have a great night, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.